Welcome, and this is the first lecture for chapter 33. We're going to be going over imperialism, and I'm going to be focusing on contextualizing this chapter in the scope of world history during the period of 1750 to 1900, and that's going to be based on the key concepts for the AP exam. So we'll start by taking a look at this cartoon, and you read a little bit about the Qing dynasty and the weakening of the Qing dynasty in the last chapter. And you could see from this political cartoon the competition between European states. You see Germany, France, the United States is represented, Russia, Japan, Italy, Austria, and Great Britain as they are trying to divide territory in China. And in China, imperialism is going to look like economic control. Imperialism is going to take different shapes depending on which region of the world. There are going to be different methods of control and different justifications that Europeans will give to conquer land. And that's going to be one of the major characteristics of this time period. And it's directly connected to industrialization and the need for resources. And so by the 1900s, the strongest of these empires was Great Britain. Britain had, at one point, the biggest empire. And there was a saying that the sun never sets on the British Empire, because at some given point in time, you could see colonial possessions in North America, in Central America, in the Caribbean, in South America, throughout Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, India, and then Australia and New Zealand. All had territory under British control at one point. So we're going to look at understanding this concept of imperialism and what allowed it to be carried out. You're going to see a lot of political cartoons, and you want to start being able to get good at analyzing images, political cartoons, trying to interpret the point of view of the artist, seeing what we could learn from it. So here's a political cartoon showing Germany. You could tell by the helmet, and that is the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, one of the figures that you should be familiar with. You see Russia with their grab bag, and Britain kind of waiting his turn. And then you could see where they're competing for land in Central Asia. So this is what you read in your chapter about the Great Game and this competition for control throughout Central Asia. So let's take a look at the key concept 5.2, which out of Unit 5, the time period of 1750 to 1900, is the chapter that deals with empire building. As industrialized states began to advance their economies, they also began expanding existing overseas empires and establishing new colonies and transoceanic empires. This is directly connected to industrialization. The rapid use of natural resources forces them to go seek them wherever they can. And so you can see from this map, the colors represent the imperial powers, and there you see who the imperial powers are. Belgium, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, and the United States. So with the exception of the United States and Japan, the rest of these are Western European countries that are carrying out industrialization, because these are the places that industrialized, right? And when Japan began to industrialize, like we read after the Meiji Restoration, they too began to be a colonial power in East Asia. Taking a look at this quote from Cecil Rhodes. Okay, Cecil Rhodes was a British writer, and here he writes, "We must find new lands from which we can easily obtain raw materials and at the same time exploit the cheap slave labor that is available from the natives of the colonies. The colonies would also provide a dumping ground for surplus goods produced in our factories." So this quote really gives you the European motives for imperialism. One, they're seeking places to get raw materials, palm oil, cotton, different types of lumber, different, oil, anything that you could think of, minerals that are going to go into the metals that they're going to use in their factories or in some part of the production process. They're also looking for places to exploit cheap labor, right? Taking advantage of the people in the colonies. And then also using the colonies to provide a dumping ground for surplus goods, which means factories are making a lot of goods and not all of them are selling. So instead of having them inventoried and just stocked in their warehouses, they could sell them to the people they colonize. So the colonies also become markets for European products. And this is still that system of mercantilism where the colony is not an equal trading partner, but someone that's going to be your customer and your source of cheap labor. So you could see the motives behind colonialism, imperialism, and also the way that, the way Europeans think of people that are not European. This is also the beginning, the birth of the more modern form of racism we see. It starts with the transatlantic slave trade, and it really accelerates during the age of imperialism out of a need to justify the actions that Europeans will take. And so we're looking at how industrialized powers established transoceanic empires. States that had existing colonies strengthened their control over those colonies. Industrialization gave them better technology, better weapons, faster transportation, things like better ships, the building of canals, telegrams, railroads. All of these technologies allowed Europeans who had colonies to strengthen the grip and make it easier to control people in faraway lands. And so one example is British India. In the 1600s, the Mughal emperors allowed British merchants to settle on the coast and establish colonies. Remember, we talked about the British East India Company, right? Local princes allow Europeans in the East India Company to acquire rights to collect taxes from the Mughals. And pretty soon the Europeans start growing opium in India, selling it to China. In 1857, Indian soldiers that were being hired by the East India Company rebel against the company for treatment. And as a result of the Sepoy Rebellion or the Sepoy Mutiny, Britain intervenes, the crown intervenes, the queen intervenes, takes the control away from the East India Company and then gives it to the British government. And from that point on, Britain starts to colonize India as one of its own territories. And that signals the end of the Mughal Empire. In the Dutch East Indies, in Indonesia, the Dutch, who had established companies by the Dutch East India Company, remember, going back to these trading posts? So these companies that had trading posts expand their control during this period. And as rivalries escalate, the Dutch extend their authority. They tighten control. They become more brutal in the way they control the Indonesian people. And the Dutch East Indies, which is again today Indonesia, becomes one of the most profitable colonies for the Dutch. So looking at the map, what you see in red is what they held by the year 1800. And you could see in orange how they extend control over Java, over Borneo in the 1800s up to 1870. And then between 1871 and 1942, they take over most of Indonesia, like you could see again on that map. And then European states, as well as the United States and Japan, begin to establish empires throughout Asia and in the Pacific. And then the Spanish and Portuguese empires decline. And so remember, we're looking at the period of 1750 to 1900, right? So this is the age of independence. So the Latin American colonies, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina, Gran Colombia, right? Those were Spanish and British colonies, Spanish and Portuguese colonies, and that they begin to break away, right? So you see Spanish and Portuguese influence decline, like it says here. The United States begins to rise as an imperial power. Not only is it expanding westward over land that used to be Mexico and land that used to belong to different Native American tribes, land it purchased from the French, who took it from the Native American tribes. They also begin to claim protectorate status over the Hawaiian Islands. In 1893, planters overthrow Queen Liliuokalani and they illegally seize Hawaii for the United States and make it an American colonial possession. After the Spanish-American War in 1898 and 99, the United States takes control of Guam and the Philippines, and they promise to support independence, but they don't. And that leads to resistance and the growth of Filipino nationalism. So here you see a map showing the American colonial possessions. You could see the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, and then U.S. possessions throughout the Pacific, including places like Guam, the Philippines, Samoa, Midway, Hawaii. And some of these territories are still U.S. possessions today. And so here we see this cartoon, again, be able to analyze the year 1898 at the top represents the year of the Spanish-American War, something you should have read in this chapter. And you should know that American imperialism begins in this year. This is kind of what sets the United States on a course of being an imperial power when they take Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, the Ladrones Islands from the Spanish in the Spanish-American War. And you could see from the cartoon, right? I was talking about earlier the racist justification. You're going to begin to see cartoons and imagery and take a look at how European and Western people are portrayed. Look at Uncle Sam. Look at Lady Liberty sitting at the table. Look at the people in the background. And then compare the way they are drawn to the way the people of the Ladrones Islands, the Philippines, right? You could see the Philippines, the cartoonish looking face, right? And so you could see how people in colonial territories were viewed as primitive, as uncivilized, and this was portraying them this way was a way to justify the brutal treatment. The Chilean poet Pablo Neruda in the 1950s, right, wrote about the imperialism that was taking place in Latin America. Another way that the United States acted as an imperial power was through economic imperialism by using American companies to go in there and establish control over lands, using their business influence to corrupt local governments or control local governments, as the case was in Hawaii, right? And hear this poem. When the trumpet sounded, it was all prepared on earth. The Jehovah parceled out the earth to Coca-Cola Incorporated, Anaconda, Ford Motors, and other entities. The Fruit Company Incorporated reserved for itself the most succulent, the central coast of my own land, the delicate waste of America. It rechristened its territories as the Banana Republics, and over the sleeping dead, over the restless heroes who brought about the greatness, the liberty, and the flags, it established the comic opera, abolished the independencies, presented crowns of Caesar, unsheathed envy, attracted the dictatorship of the flies, Trujillo flies, Tacho flies, Carrillas flies, Martinez flies, Ubico flies. So the flies it's referring to, these are Latin American dictators that ran corrupt governments that were working with these American companies to bring dollars to themselves, but not necessarily to develop their countries. And that's kind of what Neruda is talking about, right? How these companies saw themselves as superior, as if they were given this land by God, right? It says, the damp flies of modest blood and marmalade, drunken flies who zoom over the ordinary graves, circus flies, wise flies, well trained in tyranny. Among the bloodthirsty flies, the fruit company lands its ships, taking off the coffee and the fruit. The treasure of our submerged territories flow as though on plates into the ships. So that's referring to the United Fruit Company, one of the economic businesses that had a lot of control in Central America. And because of that, that's why they call them banana republics, because they were controlled by a fruit company who is extracting the resources out of Latin America. And meanwhile, the Indians are falling into the sugared chasms of the harbors, wrapped for burials in the midst of the dawn. A body rolls, a thing that has no name, a fallen cipher, a cluster of the dead fruit thrown down on the dump, right? And this is when you begin to see Latin America become more dependent on the United States, on foreign capital, like we'd studied in chapter 29 and chapter 31. And they start to see the development of corruption and the extraction of the wealth that they would have needed to themselves develop an economy. Instead of being independent, they're dependent on the United States. European states, as well as the United States and Japan, established empires throughout Asia and the Pacific, right? So in Japan, you see Meiji Japan begin to have a drive for empire on the islands of East Asia. They forced the Korean leaders to submit to their own unequal treaty, and in 1894 they declared war on China. In 1904 1905, they fought the Russo Japanese War. You could see Russia in purple that expanded all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and competition there for land in northern Manchuria, put Japan and Russia in conflicting interests, and they fought the Russo-Japanese War, and they defeated Russia. So Japan begins to arrive on the scene, and Japan begins to sell itself as the protector of Asia, right? Asia for Asians, which really wasn't. It was more like Asia for Japan. European states used both warfare and diplomacy to expand their empire. So we're going to look at the different ways that people gained empire. And you're going to see this in the writing assignment you're going to get this week. So for example, the British in West Africa used diplomacy, right? They gained control diplomatically. They established the Royal Niger Company to operate in the lower Niger River Valley. So they would send European businessmen who would sign treaties with Nigerian rulers to give the Royal Niger Company rights to trade along the coast, and that's how they begin to gain control, right? They're using their influence, they're promising to bring in, railroads and other types of technology and develop the economies of the African countries, but really they're extracting the resources for themselves. So that's an example of taking things diplomatically, where rulers realize, okay, if we don't do this, they're going to take it anyway by force. So they're going to try to get something out of it. And this becomes part of the process in the scramble for Africa. Look at the map of Africa in 1880. And in northern Africa, you could see in blue, France had extended its control, into northern Africa in Algeria. And you could see Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire, so was Tripolitania, which is Tripoli. But look at the rest, right? There's the Sokoto Caliphate in the middle. These are all mostly African kingdoms. There's a colony down in South Africa, the Cape Colony. But everything else, they are different kingdoms. So Africa is pretty much independent. But by 1913, just 33 years later, you could see the only parts of Africa that remained free of European control were Ethiopia and Liberia. Everything else on there was under the control of either the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Britain and Spain. Portugal and Spain had small possessions. Belgium had a lot of land in Central Asia, the Congo. And that was part of the scramble for Africa that you read, right? You could see here the British Army stationed in front of the pyramids, right? The British begin to take control of Egypt. Egypt had become independent from the Ottoman Empire, and business interests went in there to negotiate with the Egyptian government to build the Suez Canal, a canal that would allow them to get shipping through from the Mediterranean into the Indian Ocean. And then the other example was by taking land through warfare, and that was the example of what you see the Belgians do in the Congo. King Leopold II establishes the Congo Free State, and he's developing this colony as his own personal source of wealth. He establishes rubber plantations. Rubber is needed in factories and machinery and in parts, and it's run by forced labor. They enslave the people of the Congo, and they brutalize them in order for them to extract the resource. An estimated 4 to 8 million people died as a result of the actions of Leopold II, and many people today, historians, look at Leopold II as deserving of the same kind of treatment Hitler and Stalin get for his actions. Here there's a photograph of a man who is contemplating looking at the hand and the foot of his child who had it cut off because he wasn't meeting the quota that the Belgians wanted. Here are some political cartoons alluding to that violence in the Congo. Right here it has King Leopold as a serpent in the rubber coils, right? Instead of the snake coils, it's rubber because that's what the Belgians were taking. And you see the other picture of King Leopold surrounded by a bunch of bloodied heads. that had gotten cut off. So this is the type of actions countries that were calling themselves European, civilized, advanced, superior, were acting with this brutality and really justifying it with racism. There's another form of colonies, and those are called settler colonies. So settler colonies are where Europeans went there to settle the land as opposed to just to take the resources, but to live there and have a lot of people migrate there. Southern Africa had been established as a settler colony in 1652 by the Dutch East India Company. And the Dutch Boers fought the Afrikaners, which are the British settlers, in the Boer War, and immigration begins to increase. So as immigration increases, it puts the British and the Dutch settlers into conflict. After the discovery of gold is when they begin to have a war. But you see South Africa settled by a lot of Europeans. Even today, about 10% of the population of South Africa is white. Same thing in Australia and New Zealand. If you look at the populations today, they are of European descent. Australia and New Zealand became settler colonies. So in 1788, New South Wales is established mostly for convicts, and the discovery of gold in 1851 leads to more migration, and that was the gold rush in Australia. European migration increases to New Zealand and Australia at the demise of the native population. So as the Europeans arrive, they begin to push the native populations out of the good land, the desirable land, the ports, and push them in Australia, into the outback, into the desert country. French Algeria was also a settler colony. So even today, a lot of Algerians are European descendants. The way, this is just across the Mediterranean Sea. So the way we see Alaska, right? Alaska could be disconnected from the United States, and it's a little bit away, but it's close enough, right? We consider it a state. Or Hawaii, which is across in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, is part of the U.S. That is the way the French see Algeria, or saw Algeria, as it becomes a colony in 1827 until its independence in the 1960s. So it was administered as an integral part of France. It wasn't administered as a colony. It was seen as part of the French Empire, part of France. Hundreds of thousands of Europeans migrate to Algeria, though Muslims in North Africa remain the majority. And then industrialized states practiced neo-colonialism in Latin America, and that's a form of economic imperialism. So we see this like in the Opium Wars, right? The Opium Wars is a form of economic imperialism or neo-colonialism. So what I talked about earlier in Latin America with the fruit companies is similar to what's happening, how China was controlled. Latin American countries were never conquered. They never became European possessions or American possessions. They were independent countries, but their governments were corrupted by American business interests and served the needs of American business interests. And when the American businesses didn't get their way, they would use interventions with the US military. Similarly is what's happening in China with the Treaty of Nanjing and the Opium Wars that you read about in the last chapter. Britain gains most favored nation status, which gives it exclusive rights to trade out of the port of Hong Kong, sparking an interest by other countries. Britain attempted to open all of China, but it wasn't able to open it all. But there are 80 different treaty ports, 80 different unequal treaties that were signed. And you can see that in this map here, the different treaty ports. And then so again, investment in Latin America gave the United States more control. You could see this political cartoon alluding to that, right? The dollar sign. But it shows that, it shows it as a snake where the Latin Americans are trying to keep the United States at bay. The United States issues the Monroe Doctrine in the 1830s, attempting to keep Europeans away, right? So now that Latin America had gained independence from Spain and Portugal, the United States says, hey, this is in the American sphere of influence. We don't want any Europeans to colonize in the Americas. We are an independent territory. But really what they're doing is they're trying to make Latin American countries benefit the United States. So the United States influences the region economically by investing, promoting free trade in the region. But they did so not for the benefit of the Latin American people, as was seen in the Neruda poem. So we're going to look at the justifications for imperialism in the next lecture. All right, so make sure you watch the next lecture as well.